Okay, I want to talk briefly about the circulatory and respiratory systems, comparing them between different organisms in the vertebrate group and possibly some other body systems in a moment. So just to remind you, a circulatory system carries the blood or hemolymph around the body of the organism to bring, or animal I should say, to bring oxygen to the body tissues, take carbon dioxide away, bring nutrients to the body tissues, and take wastes like nitrogenous wastes away. So it's kind of like a highway for transport. In vertebrates, the circulatory system is called the cardiovascular system. It involves three types of vessels and a heart pump. So the arteries are vessels that carry the blood away from the heart. Most of the time it's oxygenated, but not always. So anytime a blood vessel is moving away from the heart, it's an artery. Anytime the blood vessels are moving blood back to the heart from the body, it's a vein, or the lungs, it's a vein, back to the heart. And then capillaries are the little vessels that are in between the arteries and the veins. And the capillaries are where the gas exchange, or really where all the exchange happens between the body tissues and the bloodstream. It's going to be across the capillaries. It's just like one cell thick, so diffusion can happen easily. So this is one example of a type of cardiovascular system in fish. So these are two-chambered hearts. Fish has two chambers. And so the atrium is a smaller, less muscular chamber. That's the one that it first goes into. You can see that here. So the blood comes from the body into the atrium. Then it goes through a valve and gets pumped into the ventricle. This is a very muscular chamber. And then in this case, the ventricle is just going to pump it to the gills. It picks up oxygen from the gills, and it gets transported to the body, drops off the oxygen at the body, picks up some carbon dioxide, and gets pumped back to the atrium. So we can look at this here. We call this kind of circulatory system a single circulation. So that means that it just comes in the heart, goes to in one chamber, goes to the next chamber, and then leaves the heart. So it's just one in, one out of the heart. So you can see here the gill capillaries. So it goes, picks up oxygen in the gill capillaries. It's going to drop those off, the oxygen off at the body capillaries, pick up some carbon dioxide, come back, it's a vein because it's going towards the heart, to the atrium, get pumped to the ventricle pumps it very strongly away from the heart and an artery to the gill capillaries. You'll also notice that all this is colored blue. Now all blood is really red. There's no such thing as blue blood in humans. We have hemoglobin. Hemoglobin makes your blood look red. It just looks blue underneath your skin because of the skin pigments and layers of tissue, but not because the blood's blue. But in this case, blue is representing oxygen poor, and you'll notice that the blood that's in the heart of the fish is always oxygen poor. It only picks up oxygen after it leaves. That's different than this double circulation. So land vertebrates, like your amphibians, the reptile group, including birds and mammals, they all have double circulation. So we have two different circuits here. So we have a pulmonary circuit, that's shown on top in these pictures. And we have a systemic circuit, which is shown on the bottom. And you can see both circuits go from the heart away and back to the heart, from the heart away and back to the heart. The pulmonary, if you know any kind of, the word pulmonary means lungs, so pulmonary going to the lungs. Systemic goes to the body system. So here are three types of hearts, three major hearts of double circulation. So the first one is the heart we see in amphibians. So this amphibian heart is three-chambered. So you do see that it has both deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. There's a little bit of mixing because there is only one ventricle. So let's track this. So the blood comes from the body into the atrium, the right atrium, goes into the ventricle. From the ventricle, it gets pumped to the lungs, and then comes back from the lungs to the left atrium, gets pumped back into that same ventricle, and then gets pumped out to the body, and then drops the oxygen off at the body, picks up carbon dioxide, and brings it back to the heart in the right atrium. So there is some mixing of deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. There are also channels in the heart that prevent the mixing from happening too much. And I should also add, this is called a pulmocutaneous circuit because cutaneous means skin. So the frog or the amphibians, they also pick up oxygen from their skin. It's going to be a frog. you're actually going to see here that this is the blood coming from the body. This is the blood coming from the skin. It's oxygenated already. And that blood dumps with the stuff that's deoxygenated from the body and comes into the right atrium. And so it's bringing oxygen in from the body as well as then it goes up to the lungs, picks up oxygen from the lungs, comes back in all oxygenated, and then is distributed to the body. Reptiles, not including birds, they have a 3-chambered heart, which is almost a 4-chambered heart. So they have 2 atria and 1 ventricle that's mostly separated but not entirely. So we call it an incomplete septum or partial septum. And so what this means is there's a little bit of mixing, but not very much at all. So this makes a lot more efficient heart. It also has a really interesting characteristic where there's another exit from after going through the ventricle, and what can happen is that the blood can actually bypass the lungs when the organism's underground or underwater. So the lungs are not getting any oxygen underwater, and so what happens is that the pressure changes. The water pressure actually squeezes this artery shut, and it opens up instead this artery here, which is they're calling the right systemic aorta, and so it just bypasses that and goes to the body, and then it comes back into the heart. So it can keep distributing the oxygen. Now there's no new oxygen coming into the body, but it can take whatever's left and bring it back into the body without having to go through the lungs and not pick up oxygen there. So that's a real advantage to actually having a not 4-chambered heart, because you wouldn't be able to do that with 4 chambers. It would be completely split. But in general, when the organism is in the air or not underwater, the blood's going to flow from the right atrium to the right ventricle to the lungs, pick up oxygen, drop off carbon dioxide, come back to the left atrium, the left ventricle, and then go to the systemic circuit, to the systemic capillaries, drop off oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, and come back. Mammals and birds, which are the biggest energy spenders of the vertebrate group, they're both endothermic, meaning they have to generate their own body heat to keep homeostasis, so they're using lots of energy for that. They also, birds, have a lot of energy that's used for flight. So these actually have completely separate 2 separate atria and 2 separate ventricles. So it's very, very efficient for separating oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. You don't get any mixing there. You don't have any way to shunt off the lungs, but both these organisms live pretty much, some birds and some mammals go underwater, but not as much as the reptiles do as a whole group. So we go in the right atrium to the right ventricle, get pumped to the lungs, back to the left atrium, left ventricle, pumped to the body, and so forth. Here's a human heart, and you see when we say pulmonary circuit, this is what we're talking about. So it comes out and goes to the one lung on the one side, that's pulmonary circuit. Goes to the other lung on the other side, that's a pulmonary circuit, picks up your oxygen, drops off carbon dioxide, comes back into the left atrium, then goes to the systemic to the body. Some of it's going to go up into the upper part of the body in humans. Some will go down into the bottom part of the body, the lower part of the body. All that deoxygenated blood will come back into the right atrium. So when we get the blood, we mentioned the capillaries are where the gas exchange actually occurs. And so in order for the gas exchange to happen, we actually need the gas to come into the body. And so that's what the respiratory system is going to be responsible for, bringing the oxygen gas in and bringing the carbon dioxide gas and the excess water out. And so that's our next topic. So respiratory systems can be gills, and many vertebrates like this fish. It's a gill system. And gills have 2 major processes. So the first thing that happens is the fish has to get the water coming over its gills. So in some fish, like chondrichthyan fish, as in sharks, they open their mouth and the water flows over the gills. We see the fish, the bony fish, the ray-finned fish and lobe-finned fish, they also open their mouths. And the operculum, the covering of the gill, it'll also flap. You've probably seen fish do that. It flaps in order to pull water across. So that's the ventilation. Then once the water is moving across, it has to extract oxygen from that water. And so there's this system here called countercurrent flow. And this really increases the efficiency of getting the oxygen out of the water. There's a lot more oxygen percentage in air than water, and so the efficiency of the gills is very high to get that oxygen out of the water. So what happens is that water is going to flow one direction. So looking at this bottom picture here, water is going to flow to the right, but blood flows to the left. And basically what this means is that you always match up your low oxygen levels in the water with low oxygen in the blood, and high oxygen levels in the water with high oxygen levels in the blood. What this means is that if it's low and high, particularly the low and low, that means that even if it's low oxygen in the water, it's still higher than the deoxygenated blood. So the diffusion should occur from the water into the capillary to oxygenate the blood. As the blood gets more and more oxygenated, in order to get the flow of the oxygen to keep going into the capillary, you need more and more oxygenated water. So as the blood flows and picks up oxygen, it also has the water that's most oxygenated on that side as well. So basically what would happen is if you had them flow in the same direction, you could basically get a 50% oxygenation, and then after that, the blood would be higher than the water, and so either there would be no exchange, or more likely the blood would actually lose oxygen to the water until it got back to 50%. You can also see there's lots of surface area in these gills, lots of filaments, surface area, the lamella, and so all the surface area helps increase the amount of gas exchange that can occur. In the tetrapods, there are lungs, internal lungs, that are the gas exchange structures. They are highly folded. That increases the surface area, and they're within the body of the organism, which means that they're not going to dry out. So amphibians have quite small lungs. They also use their bodies, their skin, like we saw in the heart. They use their skin for respiration as well. Non-bird reptiles have simpler lungs, while birds and mammals, which have a very high energy expenditure, they have high metabolic rates and more complex lungs. And that would make sense because the more metabolic processes, and by that I mean chemical reactions, the more chemical reactions that are happening, the more ATP that's needed to be made. The more ATP, the more cellular respiration. The more cellular respiration, the more oxygen you need. And carbon dioxide getting rid of. And so the more oxygen you need, the more complex the lungs. The idea here, though, is the same as we've been seeing, where the deoxygenated blood comes in, it is going to get rid of the carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen and then come out past those lungs as oxygenated blood. So here are some general structures in the respiratory system. And here are, in humans, these alveoli, which are these little clusters here, lots of surface area, capillaries surrounding those all over the place, all that gas exchange happening between those, and that makes it very efficient. The air comes in the nasal cavity and the pharynx and goes through the trachea, through the bronchus, and then into the bronchus to the bronchioles, and then at the end the bronchioles are these alveoli. Mammals have a diaphragm and a strong rib cage, and the diaphragm, as it pulls down, it creates a negative pressure which pulls air into the lungs, and as it goes back up, it's going to pushes that air back up to the lungs. So birds have a sort of double respiratory system where they have 2 rounds of inhalation per gas going in and coming out. So gas goes in, they inhale once, they exhale and it goes to their lungs. They inhale again and it goes to a sac, they exhale and it goes out of their body. So with the inhalations, it brings it in and stores it. This is oxygen-rich air. Then it's going to exhale and go to the lungs where it drops off the oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide. At the same time that's happening, the next time that happens, so now we have a second inhalation. It's going to take that deoxygenated air with carbon dioxide in it to the anterior sac. At the same time that occurs, the next breath goes in. Then when the next exhalation happens, that new breath goes to the lungs, and that old breath goes out of the body, takes the carbon dioxide waste. So it kind of ends up being that instead of us, which we have one in and then we have to wait till that goes out to get another breath in, they actually can have one breath in, one breath out, but still have gas exchange happening, then another breath in before the other breath goes out. I know that's kind of odd, but it's a very efficient system because it can have two sorts of oxygenation events sort of happening all simultaneously. All right, let's quickly look at the digestive system. So here are the major features of a human digestive system. You can go through those. Accessory organs, which produce a lot of times important enzymes and hormones for the system to work properly. And you'll see it starts at the mouth, ends at the anus, with a big tube in between. So the first thing that's going to occur is the intake. So let's look at the teeth. So in mammals, teeth are differentiated. Other organisms, they pretty much look the same. They're good for ripping or for eating plant matter, things like that. They're lacking teeth in birds. But in mammals, they're differentiated, which means they have different types of teeth that help perform different functions. So you can see the incisors are these teeth in the front. The herbivore has a prominent set of incisors. Not very big canines on the herbivore, very big canines on a carnivore. This is an omnivore, and you can see it has medium canines and medium incisors. The premolars are going to be very flat in herbivores, the same with the molars, so they'll be flat for grinding. There's a lot of molars there. In the carnivore, we see that these premolars are actually still jagged, so still good for mostly ripping and tearing the meat. Then it has a little bit of molars to grind that meat up before it goes into its body. And the omnivore, you can see, has a pretty even set of molars as well as premolars. Premolars are not too flat, not too pointy, and then the molars have nice surface area for grinding. Then the food, after it gets past the teeth and chewed up mechanically, it's going to go into the esophagus. So you'll notice that there's a trachea here and an esophagus there. And so when you have air coming in, you want the air to go down the trachea to the lungs. But when you have food coming in, you want the food to go down the esophagus to the stomach. So the way that works is that as the food comes down, it pushes this epiglottis down, which seals off the opening to the trachea. So the food goes down the esophagus, and the esophagus is contracting and relaxing muscles to get the food down into the stomach. And then once that food is passed there, then the epiglottis is then released again, and then you can breathe. When in the stomach, you'll notice that there's lots of folds of the epithelial tissue. That increases the surface area for secretion and absorption, which starts in the stomach. But a lot of what happens in the stomach is secretion of enzymes to continue digesting molecules, in particular a lot of protein digestion in the stomach. So you can see that there we have these crypts, and so they're where the gastric juices are and mucus are basically produced to protect the stomach lining, as well as to bring down the pH, lower the pH to help denature the proteins and other molecules in the food. So this is just a basic chart of these are the things that you eat: carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and fats. It's also what your body's made of. And this gives you an idea of how those get broken down into their monomers, or small components in the case of fats. And so it'll take you to, remember, ACE means enzymes, so all these are different enzymes that do these processes. When you get to the intestine, you're going to see that it has these folds in the intestine. Each of those folds actually has what we call a villus on it. So that's these little finger projections, and here's a villus. And actually, in the villus, each of those single cells that make up a finger projection here, each of those has little projections on its the top surface of its cell. These are called microvilli. So you see there's lots and lots of surface area here. In digestion, the nutrients are going to diffuse across the cells, and then they're going to get picked up by the circulatory system. These are the blood capillaries. So not only do they drop off oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide from the gut, they're also going to pick up those broken down food molecules in order to transport it to the rest of the body tissue. So you might have heard of the appendix. It's right at the cecum area where the small intestine meets the large intestine. And it's a sort of like little pouch of different sizes right at that meeting. The appendix is off to the side of that, probably involved in some immune function, but sometimes people have to get theirs taken out because it gets infected and could rupture and be very dangerous. The cecum can also have an infection. Sometimes the bacteria, there's lots of good bacteria in your gut. Sometimes the bacteria get a little out of control, or you get something off in there, and so you can actually get an inflamed and infected cecum as well. So if we look at the stomachs, we should be able to tell if something is probably a carnivore or probably an herbivore, and one of the main things is the cecum length. So the cecum here in the carnivore is very small and very large in the herbivore. It's because the cecum helps hold the bacteria and protists that are responsible for helping break down plant matter. You'll also notice that the digestive system overall is longer in the herbivore, particularly this large intestine. So that's where we're going to take the time to compact the waste and to get the water out of it. And so the cecum is one of the biggest things, though, to tell whether it's an herbivore or carnivore. Some unusual adaptations in digestive systems include the ruminants. This is a cow in particular. But ruminants are organisms that are going to eat plant matter, usually something like grass, hay. Then it goes down into their stomachs and gets started to get digested, and then comes back up into their mouth to chew more, and then can go back down into their stomachs in order to get further digested. And so you can see that here. So we have, when they talk about, you might have heard, oh, cows have 4 stomachs. Well, that's what this is showing. So the rumen is this big stomach here. The reticulum is this little stomach there. Then we have the omasum, which is here, and the abomasum, which is this stomach here. And then it goes into the intestine. So what do we have? We have it eat, it goes into the rumen, starts to get broken down, then it goes into the reticulum, further breaking down. Now it's going to go back into the mouth, get chewed up mechanically some more. Then it'll go back into this really lined, you can see it's lots of surface area here, the omasum, and then it's going to go into the abomasum, and then it's going to go into the intestine. So we've got lots of digestive processes happen, lots of bacteria and protists living in the gut, even probably some archaea, all helping break down those cellulose fibers so that the cow can actually use them. Just to remind you, there are accessory organs to the digestive system, so things like the gallbladder, which we've seen is underneath the liver. The liver makes the bile, the gallbladder stores it, and then it's going to secrete that bile when into the intestinal juice in order to help break down the fat. Pancreas, the pancreas secretes different types of enzymes to help break down break down food as well, and then the acid chyme, so the stomach, some of those cells are going to also secrete juices that go into the gut as well.